Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for making it on time and to this panel on the influence of cultural traditions and social norms on access to sexual reproductive health and rights and what CEDAW's got to do with it. My name is Azda Karam. I serve as the Senior Advisor at the United Nations Population Fund on Culture and Social Development, and it's a great honor to be invited by Progressio, who have labored hard to put this excellent panel together. My job really is to take tremendous the sense of privilege of being able to introduce a very distinguished group of panelists to discuss an issue that I'm sure each of you knows is incredibly critical, and they have very different expertise and will be able to advise us. Many of you are very familiar with the fact that very often when it comes to gender-based violence, violence against women, harmful traditional practices, the issue is always associated, the lack of women's rights, the fight against women's rights, the fight against gender equality. Very often, social norms and cultural traditions are the blame, the key factor that is often assigned the blame or the issue or the problem. Sometimes we're smart enough to also identify the political and economic constraints, and sometimes we're able to see how the political, the economic, the social, the cultural, and the legal all come together to form a very important dimension. For those of us who work on culture in the UN system, we understand it to be not only the social norms and traditions, but we also understand that under the framework of culture, the issue of political dynamics, governance mechanisms, legal realities, all features under what comes and gets identified as cultural contexts. So that's why the panel today has a very distinguished group of people. I will not read out their full bios, but I'd like to point out first Ms. Obi Nwankwa, who sits on the CEDAW committee, serves our CEDAW committee. We have also Siva, the Executive Director of the Asia Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women, ARROW. We're also very privileged to have Mr. Magbain Kandawire, who is the Executive Director of Youth, Net and Counseling, and previously a lecturer in chemistry education. Ms. Shabina Begum was called to the bar in 2009 and admitted as a solicitor in 2013 and is a winner of several distinguished awards. And last but by no means least, the Policy and Advocacy Officer of Progressio, the host and the organizer of today's meeting, Ms. Fatima Haas, who leads Progressio's advocacy work on young women and girls' sexual and reproductive health and rights, as well as on violence against women and girls. As you can see, a very distinguished panel, and without further ado, I'd like to ask the order in which you will speak first, and that will be Fatima. Please welcome Fatima.
Sorry for that noise. I'm here today to share with you some stories and some testimonies from a trip to Zimbabwe that I undertook last year. Progressio works in Zimbabwe alongside communities and local civil society organizations, and we support them to build their capacity to challenge power structures that keep them poor and marginalized. So I'm here today to share with you some of the stories and testimonies, and I will focus specifically on 3 issues in my talk. First, what are the key messages, social norms, and social expectations that young women in Zimbabwe grow up with regarding when to marry and when to have children? Secondly, I want to shine light on how are those messages communicated and who is involved in communicating them, and are there any traditions and customs attached to it? And then thirdly, if we have time, maybe make a reference to CEDAW, but this might come up later as well. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So when I spoke to young women, older women, boys and men, I was struck that every single person I interviewed and I encountered within the 2 weeks, and when I asked them what is expected from young women, the answers was at some point of the conversation always the same. They're expected to marry early and they're expected to get pregnant soon afterwards. This is not to say that there are no other people in Zimbabwe thinking differently, but I was struck how often this answer was mentioned in conversations. I would like to quote directly. Young girls in our society are more respected when we are wives and mothers. I am not married and I have not found a suitor yet. I am therefore called Tikombi by my peers. That means that I'm at a marriageable age, but I haven't found a man yet. I'm 16 years old. So this young woman grew up aspiring to marry because she felt that she's more respected when she gets married. She felt that she's of more value to get married. A girl's value and status is rising immediately after the marriage, and her status in society, but also in church, changes immediately. So there's a difference of respect. Now I would like to look at early pregnancies after marriage. I would like to quote Laurel. A woman's pregnancy is a major issue after you get married. She might not feel the pressure immediately, but she knows that it is coming soon, and therefore she will be stressed. Women define themselves of value when they are married and have children. We grow up knowing what's expected from us. And again, that doesn't mean that every single woman in Zimbabwe feels the same, but that was something that came out quite strongly from the conversations I had. I would then also look into which traditions and customs are attached to it. And before I do that, I would like to recognize that every culture has so many rich and empowering values. But sometimes we also encounter structures that are reflecting quite a patriarchal way of thinking. And again, I would like to quote Laurel. Here, when a woman gets married, we have bridal showers. I go to a lot of them. They take it as a platform to talk about everything that's relevant for women before they get married. In some, they're telling us what a real woman is. In all bridal showers, there's one key message. If your husband should see you as a real woman, you always need to be submissive. He gets married to you because he wants to have a submissive wife. They also tell us that our role is in the kitchen and bedroom. And I ask her, who is they? Who is telling you these things? And she said, at those bridal showers are the patriarchal aunts, which is the sister of your father, women from the church, probably the pastor's wife, and your grandmother. These women are saying it in different ways, but the message is the same. You need to be submissive. The aunts on your father's side are more powerful than your mother, grandmother, or even mother-in-law. They're the female custodians of culture because they're the representative of your father. And I was really struck by how this informal way of actually coming together to celebrate a marriage that is exciting has been also used as a platform to spread more conservative messages around what's expected from a woman. And I was struck by hearing from young women and older women that they actually thought that the messages are not as inclusive and gender equal as they could be. It's not about what a woman could expect from a marriage. It's not about, the focus is not a woman, but the focus is actually quite a lot of a man. And then another thing that I would like to mention is the issue of lobola. Lobola is a bride price that a man has to pay to before he gets married to his fiancée, and it's actually quite a burden for men, especially in a society where in Zimbabwe, where officially 95% are unemployed, to pay something like $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 to get married, and that is a lot of stress and a big burden on men. Again, I would like to quote someone directly. It's Grace. Lobola is a good way to appreciate the parents of a woman, but it should not be commercialized because the results is that men are taking their wives as property. But it should not be commercialized because that results in men taking their wives as properties they acquired. When there's no child in the marriage, the groom's family often says things like, "But we paid so much for you." The civil society talks about the pros and cons of lobola and about the impact of the practice on the union. And again, I think that's something that we really need to be aware of. We're not talking about forced marriage here in this matter, but there are still values that are attached to what it means to be a girl, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a wife, that are not as inclusive for women as we would like them to be. So this is just a brief introduction to the topic, and then we hear more from other experts. But I would like to keep us in mind CEDAW articles which say that it's the responsibility of governments to abolish or change and challenge existing laws or modify existing laws, customs and traditions that are discriminating against women and girls. Thank you.
Looks like we'll all have that sound. You can see I'm the only man sitting here. Yeah, it's quite challenging. Yesterday I had a similar scenario where I was sitting, I was the only man. My name is McBen. I work with the young people in Malawi, and I'm going to talk about child marriages. But before I talk about that, I'm trying to see there are less and less men here, and yet it is the men who are getting married to children. So that's worrying, and I hope as a women's movement you will spend a bit of time to engage more men to make sure that they're taking part in this process. Getting back to Malawi, it's a high burden country when we talk about child marriages. 50% of the girls will be married off by the age of 15. And of course the fertility rate for the girls is also quite high. And the issue that you begin to ask in the context of culture is what are the things surrounding that? And key to it are the very cultural beliefs and values that you have. Most of you might have engaged with, but in Malawi in particular, I want to bring 4 issues that are really worrying us as a country and what things have happened. The first one is, of course, masculinity. The issue of masculinity is quite key when it comes to issues of forced and child marriages, and that's an issue that we need to talk about a little bit more, especially if we are going to engage men to be able to deal with the issues. And then more often, the perception is that women and the girls are being prepared to satisfy the man. And I always have asked a question, who said women doesn't want sexual satisfaction? That it's only the girls being prepared. You have to do this to be able to satisfy the man. And this comes in the context of the cultural initiation ceremonies that we have, where the girls, when they're getting out of the cultural initiation ceremonies, the belief is that they have to be ready to make sure that the man is happy. And that drives quite a lot of agenda when it comes to the issue of their sexual and reproductive health. And then there is also a big challenge about leadership, local leadership in particular. I'm looking at the traditional leaders, wherever they're having their meetings. One of the things that is coming quite often is the issue around the girls being taken aboard to make sure that they are entertaining the so-called local leaders. And that has also been a big issue at that level. So all these things need to be looked at in the context of how are we going to address the cultural and traditional things. Then the very big question is the low value that is being placed on the girl child. So you get to the school system, starting with the family. In your houses, you begin to see that the girls are not being given the attention that they're supposed to be given. So their value in the house is low. They get into the school system, the value is low. Actually, when the girl is getting out to working, the first thing, even the teachers, coming from a background of a teacher myself, I could see a lot of girls being harassed because of who they are as girls. Not because they are not doing well, but because they're girls. A boy would do the same mistake, and then the reaction you give to the girl is quite different. It's the iPad. Okay. Okay. Then the things that you tend to think about, what has the Malawi government done in terms of fighting child marriages from the time that we started seeing that this is a main issue. So from about 2012, a movement was being put across to begin to start looking at what do we need to do to end child marriages. And therefore, starting with a program that was spearheaded by HIVOS. HIVOS is a Dutch organization based in the Netherlands that started the movement in what was called March Action Against Child Marriages, to which I was the chairperson then, spearheading the Ending Child Marriages campaign. Currently, I'm just coordinating because the movement has gone to the ministry. But I just want to say that there have been quite a lot of engagement. Organizations like UN Women, UNFPA, UNICEF, SMAVI, Plan International coming together to try and see if we can begin to fight ending the child marriages menace in the country. And this has started moving. We have quite a number of interventions ranging from the traditional leaders' engagement through to community awareness, increasing sexual reproductive health services. Actually, as I'm talking now, my team in my organization, about I think 7 teams are out on an outreach campaign, going out to engage the communities to begin to look at SRH and also looking at the ending child marriages issues. There have been some laws which have been put in place. Notably, I think the Child Justice Act 2010 has got information in terms of making sure that the children are not getting married earlier. And then we also have the recently passed Child Marriage and Family Relations Act 2015. It was just passed last year. It has got its own challenges because the Constitution, our Constitution, actually says a girl can be married at the age of 15. So that is now what we are fighting, to repeal that section to make sure that it is in line with the current law. And then we have the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act 2006. All these have been put in place to make sure that the legal framework is available to protect the girl child. But the major challenge is how do we implement that? I want to finish by asking this House to begin to think of some of the key issues that we should begin to talk about. The first one is, how do we ensure that men are becoming active participants in ending child marriages? Because they're the main culprits, they're the main people who are engaging in that. A girl child will not be married by a female, it will be married by a man in the African context. So how do we ensure that we engage in that? We should also think of how do we ensure that we invest in education that will be relevant to girls. Because sometimes what has happened is girls have not seen the relevance when they get to school. And I think if the education is put in place, especially for girls who will not be in school, you know, we get a situation, and I like the one of the production by UNICEF where it says, too old to be in a class and too young to be married. Where do you put that? So these are out of school girls who are not going to be in the school, but then they need the education. What kind of education are we going to put in place for them? And then finally, I think it is very critical that we invest a lot in ending the traditional rules and regulations that are there, because these are done by the gatekeepers, and these are the traditional leaders, and I think engaging these leaders to make sure that they change the rules is quite key. The social norms and the cultural beliefs that are there should be looked into seriously to ensure that we are making progress. Otherwise, we will be really talking in all these conferences. If we don't engage at that level, if we don't invest at that level, we might not be fighting the battle that we want to fight. Thank you.
I never knew that devices could like each other and not like each other. So you learn something new every day. Okay, so good evening, everyone. I think that one of the things that we thought we would never have after 21 years of Beijing and many more years of CEDAW is that in 2016 we would still be talking about an issue like child early and forced marriages, because surely, you know, the societies that we live in, our policymakers and our governments, we would have expected their perspectives and their paradigms to have shifted with these documents and all of the work that has been done, right? So I think that, so defining child early and forced marriage is very important, because we actually are talking about many different demographics of girls, young people, and adolescents, right? And sometimes people use the terms interchangeably, but this is not like advisable, because we have to identify the vulnerabilities that different groups face. One of the critical differences that you will often find is that in many cultures, cultures that child marriage is, an adolescent transitions from being a child to a woman when she first starts menstruating. So in their culture, they are no longer considered children, although under the convention and the rights of the child, their definition is still a child, but in their culture, they already consider women. So which is why early marriage is also something that you need to consider as per the definition of the Convention Against the Rights for the Rights of the Child. So we also have to look at the life cycle approach when we're talking about adolescents and girls. And it's shocking to think that many women in the world, 700 million, according to UNICEF, 700 million were married before they were 18 years of age, and about 250 million of those were married before 15 years of age. This is a very, very large number, okay? One of the systemic root causes, right, that are beyond poverty. So generally we think that poverty and lack of access to education is what forces families to marry off their daughters earlier. So, and these are the well-known causes, of course, because, and they're more easily tackled, perhaps, poverty and limited access to quality education and those living in rural areas. So this is why they think that the practice of child early and forced marriage happens. However, we also need to look at ingrained patriarchy together with narrow religious, cultural, and traditional interpretations of gender equality and women's position within the family and society further the practice. And it was quite shocking for us because although I come from a regional organization that works across 17 countries, I actually come from a country like Malaysia, and Malaysia has been a very developed, progressive country for many, many years now. And we actually have a higher rate of development than most countries. We have reduced poverty, and one of those strategies was actually providing universal access to education. So we actually, the whole country has access to education which is free, right? And of course, because we're a small population, 26 million, so it was able to provide that. However, recent statistics, and this just emerged out of the blue, right? Not out of the blue, but through like some particular reports and particular census. There was actually, suddenly we found there were 2,000, 3,000 girls getting married every year below the age of 15. So if you have something, and this is what we go and tell governments, isn't it? We said if you provide universal access to education for girls and you give incentives for parents to send girls to schools, then this practice of CEFM will cease slowly, right? And yet this is a very interesting dichotomy that's coming up, because you have this and yet you have this practice. We also had, and of course, when the women's rights NGOs found out about it, because we never thought it was happening in our country, right? But when the women's rights NGOs found out about it, and then they went to do their advocacy, you're not going to believe what the government did. So they took out the age bracket. So now, if you see the later census, you cannot identify how many were married before the age of 18. So and then they had another thing, because under UNAIDS they reported how many people were tested for HIV. Then we had like large numbers of young girls who were tested for HIV below the age of 18, because actually we're going to get married, and so they have compulsory HIV testing, especially for Muslim couples. So they captured those numbers. So that was another evidence for us that this practice is continuing. Oh, wow. Now, sorry. Okay, so what, I think Mr. Mbinge has already said quite a bit about SRHR. I would like to extend a little bit. So, child early and forced marriage, limits girls and young women's SRHR in many ways. It poses physical and psychological health implications. It affects the reproductive health and rights of girls. They are more vulnerable to early pregnancy, as you have also pointed out, and related complications, because because early pregnancies, younger ages, and you can die during the childbirth. You could have morbidities like fistula, and their bodies are not physically prepared to have children. I think some other data by WHO and all also help tell that younger women in marriages are actually more vulnerable to violence, which is something that you've also brought up. So I think these are all the aspects of reproductive health which are very important. But we must also while there is a health impact, we must also understand that CEFM really infringes on the reproductive rights of girls and adolescents, right? Girls are not empowered to make decisions within their relationships, including with their bodies, lack access to accurate information about their sexual and reproductive health, including contraception, availability, access and use to all other reproductive health services, including the access to safe abortion services as well. So their sexual health and rights are also limited. They're unable to express their sexuality and make free and informed decisions related to who they enter into relationship with, and whether they want to have sex or not. And their sexual health is also undermined with the inability to be protected from violence and to access information and services and STI protection. Okay. So it also limits the bodily integrity and enjoyment of childhood. We all wish we were back there, right? And we can't go back. So what are the legal limitations and lack of enforcement? So culturally and socially, we know that in many societies that girls are considered to be under the guardianship of their fathers, and this guardianship passes on to the husband after they're married, right? So they're not actually considered as a person in their own right. They're always taken care of by others. I think this also frames, where their rights come from, or whether they have rights, or what type of rights they have. And the legislation on the minimum age of marriage is very rarely enforced, especially in those countries we know in South Asia, because Bangladesh, India, because firstly, of course, there's an inavailability of the birth registration system. So when you're getting married, people don't know how old you are, or there is not a marriage registration system. So even if the law has, for example, in Bangladesh, a minimum age of marriage, there is no enforcement of this minimum age of marriage. It means nothing. Ironically, in Bangladesh, the age of consent is 14. So it's only if you marry below 14, you could be charged with statutory rape, but however, I don't think that's enforced either. Okay. And in many of our countries, what we do have is multiple legal systems, right? So we may have a secular and civil legal system that has issues such as statutory rape, has got conflict between these two, because at one point, a girl and a woman, we are a citizen of the country, but where we have access to recourse to justice, we have to then divide which court do we face, right? So I think that, so this is a very important thing we need to tackle when we are talking about helping reduce child early and forced marriage. So I think that the only last point I want to make is, so in addition to that, we also found that, we are seeing today increasing conflict. We're also seeing climate change and disasters, and there is evidence to prove that in times of emergency occurrences, that what happens is there is a tendency to marry off girls earlier. And our research in Bangladesh says that after Cyclone Sidr and Ayla, that there were families actually married because they were additionally impoverished, so they decided to then marry off their girls earlier. So this is just some thoughts that I can give you. I have some more, but my time is up.
Hello everyone. I don't have a laptop or an electronic gadget. I'm a very old-fashioned lawyer in that respect, so hopefully there'll be no technical issues. Now, before I actually start speaking about the legal perspective on early and child marriage, can I just get some audience participation, because this is actually something I'm very curious to know. I'm assuming everyone here is either from America or either from America or somewhere around the world. So be it whether you're from this state or another, from another country, can you let me know, just a show of hands, is anyone's minimum or legal age of marriage, is it below 16, the place that you come from? What age is it? Colombia. And how old? What's the age of marriage?
I found out that it's 12 years old.
Wow.
Although it's a practice, child marriage is not common, but legally it would be 12.
It would be 12. Okay, thank you for sharing that. I'm going to come and speak to you at the end if that's okay. Now, you're not in trouble. It's a curiosity thing. No. Okay, so in the UK, the legal age of marriage is 18, but you can get married at the age of 16, but with parental consent. The way it works, and a lot of the work that I do at the moment on early and forced marriage, it may involve, say, a girl of 15, 16, because that's usually the age of risk. Either they're going to be forced into a marriage in England, or they're going to be taken out of England to be forced into a marriage, say, so the other side of the world, say Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, or maybe one of the Arab countries. The way we would try and then assist the girl would be to obtain either a forced marriage protection order and then supplement that with a wardship order from the High Court. And what that enables us to do is, if she's at risk of being taken outside of the country, we can get her passport removed. Or if it's her parents that are taking her, we can get their passports removed, so to stop them from taking her as well. If, however, she's left the country and we need for her to come back, if she's a British child, we can get a High Court order to request the actual corresponding authority to say, please send this girl back. So that's something that I do quite regularly, sadly, and it does occur quite a bit. So I couldn't give you figures off the top of my head, but I've represented quite a few clients from around the world that come from different kind of ethnic attachments, but are British children. Now, I actually did some research at the end of last year, so I think Savintini, is that your name? Touched upon Bangladesh, and that's the country that I was in at the end of last year, looking at their legal system and how they deal with early and forced marriage. And the reason I focused on Bangladesh is because, ethnically, my parents are from Bangladesh, I speak the language, and actually I was very curious to see what progress Bangladesh had made since the Girls' Summit in 2014, when the Prime Minister came and she pledged that she would end child marriage by 2041, but she would reduce the numbers in the next coming years. And what was interesting is when I got there, the reality was probably, what Savintini touched upon, sadly, one of the things that they'd done was statistically to hide the number of forced marriages. They were trying to reduce the legal age. Now, in Bangladesh, you're right, there is actually no minimum legal age, but the piece of legislation that actually regulates that area is the Child Marriage Restraint Act 1929. So it was in 1929 that Bangladesh had actually increased its age of marriage within that legislation to 18. Now in 2016, they're trying to reduce it to 16. With parental consent, which was shocking. For me as a lawyer, that was absolutely shocking. But what it meant is this whole raft of girls between 16 to 18 would just disappear as a statistic. And the practical consequences, as we all know, is they'll be further disempowered, and it will be easier to force them into marriages, and they most likely would go underground. But what's interesting about Bangladesh is, although it's actually a secular country, it's a Muslim majority country, and one of the things that I was asked to touch upon by Fatima is actually, then what's the religious perspective? Like, how do we actually challenge those views? And this was my penny drop moment, actually, as I was walking up here. I was thinking, how do I discuss this issue? I'm not religiously qualified. I did speak to an imam in the UK before I flew out here, and that was like the bit of information that I came with. And I was like, actually, if we all be a bit logical, I'm a huge believer, every religion will come with some form of logic. And if you apply that logic to this day and age, actually whatever the issues are, there's always a solution. Now, when we talk about child marriage, so you're talking about a 14, 15-year-old girl who's been married, regularly beaten, regularly raped, may or may not survive her wedding night, may or may not survive her first delivery. Which religion would realistically advocate for that? What would be the purpose of a religion if it advocated for that? Now, when we look at then a country like Bangladesh, once again, where there's a Muslim majority country, they have taken that proactive step of changing the minimum legal age, because it did used to be 14 in 1929. And a thing that most countries can do, most religious countries can do, is if you have a system in place, and many other, I think, because I'm talking from an Islamic perspective, many other Islamic states did this. I think the Ottoman Empire interjected when they realized that their community was being affected, the health of that community was being affected. They would change a particular law, even if from a religious viewpoint it seemed correct. They would assess that situation based on the community then. Bangladesh did this in 1929. I have no idea why they want to go backwards now, but it can be done. So I think if we are going to speak about religious perspectives and cultural perspectives, the reality is we need to keep upholding that moral ground and that moral perspective. And I think for me, the other interesting thing that I did see in Bangladesh was now the Hindu community is actually a minority community within Bangladesh, and their laws aren't, say, in line with the laws of India, where there's a Hindu majority, and I believe the legal age of marriage there is 18. But in India, the Hindu community in Bangladesh don't have a minimum legal age of marriage, so technically you could be married off at birth, and that happens. So this is just, I think for me, when I'm talking religion, and when we're talking kind of, what kind of standards can we set, I think we need to basically start being a bit more pragmatic about how we're progressing. And I think if anyone is from a state where, unfortunately the legal age of marriage is 12, I think we need to start questioning that. And it is, and I think it's one of the questions that Jenny actually asked me this morning. So, Shabina, what is it that you hope to achieve, after coming to this conference? What is it that you hope to take away? I suppose from a professional perspective, I hope to raise awareness, I hope to gain more knowledge, but what I hope to take away is a sense of responsibility. And I'm sure every other person in this room feels like that as well. So, if we've heard about this, there's a state where, once again, sorry to keep picking on you, but there's a legal age of marriage at 12. That's not the only place. There's other countries where the minimum legal age is far lower. And the reason why it's so important to make sure that the minimum legal age is increased is because up until you have a piece of legislation in place, where do you actually find accountability? It would be near enough impossible. And I think one of the powerful tools in Bangladesh is under the Child Marriage Restraint Act. One of the people that you can actually get either an injunction or some kind of legal action against is the Qazi. So it is the marriage registrar who registers the marriage. If he inappropriately registers a marriage because the girl is under the age of 18, he can get arrested or fined. And I think that's such a phenomenal initiative, because you're starting to hold your religious leaders, who are very powerful in those communities, you're finally holding them to account. And I think that's what we need to start thinking about, those measures, actually, who can we go to actually make those real differences. So thank you for listening.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm supposed to be speaking on the role of CEDAW in all these that we've had today. I'd like to start with saying that to give you a background of the mechanisms that are available to you through CEDAW to hold governments accountable to, first of all, eliminating harmful practices, enforcing or promoting the sexual and reproductive health and rights of young people and women. CEDAW, its primary role is to engage state parties. These are countries that have signed and ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. These countries appear before CEDAW. They file their reports to explain the level of implementation of the CEDAW Convention in their countries. So CEDAW committee engages these countries in a dialogue. And one role that civil society plays is that civil society files or presents shadow reports. Shadow reports are alternative reports to the government reports. So what civil society does is to bring to the knowledge of the committee members what the true situation in the country is.
For instance, a country can come and say, oh, our maternal mortality ratio is 100, as per 100,000 live births. But the CEDAW report will give us the true situation of things. In some instances, we have found that activists had brought before us reports that showed that maybe government reports are not what they should be. So this is a good way of bringing those issues as issues we're discussing today before the committee. There is also other mechanisms under the optional protocol. CEDAW has a mandate to accept communications and inquiry requests from civil society or from lawyers, which means that you can file an action before CEDAW if your right has been violated. But one key issue you must note is that all domestic remedies must be exhausted. That is, the national judicial mechanism has failed you. You can come before CEDAW, and CEDAW will give its decision. CEDAW has a very rich jurisprudence on issues of sexual and reproductive rights. There's also jurisprudence on government failure to, for example, provide the services that only women need. And these services include reproductive health services like abortion and so on and so forth. So there's also this mechanism of general recommendations that CEDAW uses. CEDAW develops what we call GRs to expand or explain the provisions of the convention so that the state parties will not claim that they do not understand, the provisions of the convention. Now, I would like to recommend to you, in relation to what we have been hearing today, the general recommendation number 19 on violence against women, number 24 on women and health. Then there's a joint CEDAW and CRC general recommendation on harmful practices, and this is number 30. So we need, there's also a statement by CEDAW on sexual and reproductive health of young people and adolescents. So we need to look at these documents. Now, CEDAW consistently notes in its concluding observations that harmful practices are deeply rooted in social attitudes and that regard women as inferior to men and boys based on stereotyped roles. In CEDAW's view, harmful practices are grounded in discrimination on the basis of sex, gender, and age, among other things, and they are often associated with serious forms of violence against women. Therefore, you all know that CEDAW Convention did not address violence against women. It was a big omission. But what CEDAW has done is to take from the other provisions and interpret discrimination as a form of violence. And this is how we have the GR number 19. So you need to be familiar with this. Any form of violence, whether physical, psychological, or emotional, we all know is a violation of the human rights of women, as well as the fundamental breach of their dignity and integrity. We know that girls and women are subjected to violent and discriminatory practices all over the world. We have FGM that has been mentioned, child marriages, there's disinheritance in some countries. There's also what they call murder of albinos. Albinos in some countries are killed because it is believed that parts of their bodies could be used for ritual purposes. It could cure HIV/AIDS. These are all erroneous, but they are there, and albinos are being killed on a daily basis because of this. There's child marriage. The panel has also made a link between harmful practices and sexual and reproductive health rights. But I'd just like to say that harmful practices are a cause of many sexual and reproductive health related problems, and unwanted pregnancy is one of them. CEDAW committee has always recommended to state parties that there must be legislation legalizing abortion in some cases, not in all cases. We are aware that the ICPD makes it clear that abortion should in no circumstances be used as a means of contraception. Therefore, CEDAW does not believe that state parties should use abortion as a contraception or contraceptive method. But what CEDAW recommends is that in 4 instances of 5, state parties should ensure that abortion is available to women. CEDAW is not saying that it must be available, women must access abortion in these circumstances, but they are open for those who would like to. Number 1 is in rape. When somebody has been raped, CEDAW says you should give the option of abortion. Where there has been incest, even in our customs and practices, we know that incest is an abomination. So where there has been incest, it should be open, that people can access abortion. Where there is a high risk to the life and to the health of the pregnant woman, there should be access to abortion. And finally, where there is likely to be severe fetal impairment, where the fetus has been shown to have deformation that will, cause a life that is not worth living, then it should be available. So these are the cases where CEDAW recommends abortion. But and then CEDAW recommends that in all other cases, no woman should be sent to prison for having had an abortion. That means decriminalizing abortion in all cases, even if it is illegal in the country. Now, again, CEDAW is interested in promoting prevention of unwanted pregnancies. If there is no unwanted pregnancy, there will be no need for abortion. And how do we prevent unwanted pregnancies? CEDAW says that you must make modern contraceptives available, accessible, and affordable. So state parties are being, on a daily basis, encouraged to ensure that this is what is happening in their countries. On child marriage, CEDAW jurisprudence, let me talk about Article 16, which states that marriage should be entered only with the free and full consent of intending spouses. But we know that this is not the case for child brides. So CEDAW regularly calls on state parties to eliminate traditional stereotypes as underlying causes of harmful practices and to raise awareness about the criminal nature of such practices. Now, Article 12 is on women and health. Article 12 also encourages state parties to ensure, on the basis of equality of men and women, access to health services, including those related to family planning. In many countries that we have engaged during my 4 years in the CEDAW committee, we found that access to contraceptive services or sexual and reproductive health services to adolescents is not quite what it should be. Where I come from, if a young girl walks into a health center to ask for contraceptives, the question will be, whose daughter is this? She is spoiled, So we still need a long way to go to encourage our state parties to understand that it's better that our adolescent girls, our young women have access to these services rather than get them involved in unwanted pregnancies. We've also seen in many countries that have appeared before us that there is an unwritten policy that girls who get pregnant in schools are expelled from schools. And when they are expelled, some are not allowed to come back. So CEDAW continuously recommends that there must be a policy, even if it is not within the policy of the state party, for these girls to remain in school. Do not expel them. They can go, but please provide a means of having them come back to complete their education. In our joint on harmful traditional practices, there is a joint general recommendation with the Committee on the Rights of the Child. In the joint GR number 31, the committees recommend that state parties to the conventions should ensure that any efforts they undertake to tackle harmful practices and to challenge and change underlying social norms are holistic. They are community-based and they are founded on a rights-based approach, which includes the active participation of all relevant stakeholders, especially women and girls who are affected. So this is very, very instructive. What are the challenges that we have seen that face state parties from promoting or enforcing or respecting the sexual and reproductive health rights of women and girls? We find that many governments are reluctant to support human rights. So this lack of support is often due to government's fear of backlash from the public. For instance, on the issue of abortion, governments are very reluctant to approve because the Catholic Church, for instance, some religious groups, they are actually out to see that this does not happen. In my country, Nigeria, we just had a law on same-sex marriage. This law, when the law came out, civil society activists were trying to see how we could stop. But traditional rulers, a conference of bishops, everybody said this is it, make it a life imprisonment. Some even advocated for death penalty for same-sex marriages. And the law is so bad that if you attend such a marriage, it's 14 years imprisonment. So this is to tell you how government's fear of backlash from the public can make it to go overboard in some of these issues. There is also the health system being very unfriendly to sexual and reproductive rights. Government was able, time? Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
No, wait, you can finish the sentence.
Okay, all right. Okay, I said government was able to come out with a policy on sexuality, comprehensive sexuality education in schools. But the Catholic schools said no to this, and that is where we are today. So we're still working on it to ensure, to convince them that introducing a young girl to sexuality education does not mean you are encouraging her to go and start, having sexual intercourse early in life. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a high note to end on. Thanks very much. I think that there's been such a rich set of information and initiatives from the very local at the community level to the national to the global. So I'm very grateful to all the different speakers. There's no way I'm going to be able to summarize all that unless you're willing to wait for another half an hour.